are on the other platform. We are right now live already. So Geeta, please start. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone. Welcome to this session on data as a stock in trade in global trade, looking beyond outdated notions around data flows. My name is Geeta Sen, and I'm the General Coordinator of DAWN, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, and I am your moderator for this panel. I want to also say that the panel is co-organized by IT for Change, the Transnational Institute, ITEM, Instituto del Tercer Mundo, New Economics Foundation, and DAWN. And I'm delighted to be doing this for DAWN in partnership with IT for Change. DAWN and ITFC have a partnership on feminist digital justice. And ITFC, of course, has a partnership with many of the other speakers and participants in this session. Before starting, some of the usual housekeeping rules, especially about questions, just put them in the Q&A. And if we have time, this is a very short panel, like all these panels, it's just 1 hour. If we have time, we will get to your questions at the end. So let's begin. Data is universally spoken of as a, if not the key economic resource today. How many times have we heard it said that data is the new oil? Strangely enough, this is not the way data is treated in global digital trade discussions. This paradox is the reason for a global stalemate on the data issue, often spoken of as a contest between good approaches, quote unquote, that is free data flows, and bad approaches, that is constraints on data flows. Some of us, at least, perhaps many of us, have experienced, I know I have, what making research data freely available becomes a conditionality for funding. An apparent level playing field for all researchers through free data flows. But of course, researchers based in the South rarely, if ever, have access to the social and professional networks, institutional supports, research and library access of their counterparts in the North. This is anything but a level playing field. Free data flows in such a case can easily mean one-way flows of data. Moving to e-commerce discussions, we will argue in this session why we have to foreground data's role as a prime economic resource in a digital economy. Treating data only in terms of privacy, security, trade facilitation, important as all of those are, is no longer enough. Earlier, this was mostly a developing country's concern, but recent policy developments in some high-income countries highlight the need for focusing directly on the economic dimensions of data. I'd like to draw your attention to 2 resources I'll soon be putting in the chat. One, why we need a new economic rights regime around data urgently, and what the emerging community data approach in India can offer us. I'll put this in the chat very soon. And secondly, a report that describes how socializing data value is top priority and why we need new network data production models beyond what might be called techno-feudalism. We also know, some of us at least, that UNCTAD has just released its digital economy report on the issue of cross-data flows and development, for whom the data flows. And that report is, of course, on the UNCTAD website, along with a short overview. This workshop seeks to address some of these issues by bringing in a group of very knowledgeable experts from both the South and the North. Vahini Naidu is coordinator of the Trade for Development program at the South Center, an international trade negotiator since 2009. She specializes in trade and services, e-commerce, and digital trade, focusing on WTO, SADC, and AFCFTA negotiations. She's a former diplomat who served as counselor at the South African Permanent Mission to the WTO in Geneva. In this role, she was appointed as focal point on services and e-commerce for the African group and as the coordinator of the African group in the WTO in 2018. Sofia Scacera is an economist and an advisor to the trade union movement in Latin America. A researcher and teacher at the World Labor Institute from the National University 3 de Febrero. She advises the Argentine Senate and is an associate researcher at the Transnational Institute. Our third speaker is Ingrid Schneider, professor of political science in the Center for Ethics in Information Technology in the Department of Informatics at the Universität Hamburg in Germany. And she has worked on technology assessment, IP, and the data economy in different fields. From 1996, she has testified and done policy advice for various parliaments and ministries in Europe, and she currently works on digitalization. And last but not least, Parminderjeet Singh, Param, as many of us know him, a senior fellow and executive director at IT for Change. His areas of work are ICTs for development, internet governance, and the digital economy. He was a part of UN working groups on internet governance forum improvements and on enhanced cooperation on international internet policy issues. He was the first elected co-coordinator of the premier global internet governance civil society group, the Internet Governance Caucus. And he's a founding member of JustNet Coalition and Internet Rights and Principles Coalition. And he has been associated with the group that helped India's draft e-commerce policy. Each panelist is going to be asked one question and will have 7 to 8 minutes to respond to that question. So, Vahini, let me start with you. Drawing on your experiences as South Africa's negotiator on e-commerce, how should we be thinking about data flows? What are the implications for global digital trade? And if you would like to make some brief comments on the new UNCTAD report on data, please go ahead and do so. Over to you, Vahini. Please take about 7 minutes for your response, and I'll give you a note when we are at your 7 minutes. Over to you, Vahini.
Okay, thank you so much, and good morning, colleagues and participants. I'm very happy to be here today. Coming from an institution, the South Center, where we represent the views of developing countries, we have for a very long time considered that the free flows of data and the liberalization of data flows in trade agreements is extremely concerning. I think we need to understand that the goal of developed countries and big tech is for the world to deregulate and allow global supply chains to be built, which developed countries already dominate and control. So essentially, the free flow of data de facto gives first movers the competitive advantage because these countries have the data infrastructure to collect, process data, and convert it into information and knowledge, which are primarily digital platforms and big tech companies located in the north, where most of the data centers are hosted. So to make sense of it in practical terms, the free flow of data is essentially a one-way flow of data out of developing countries into developed countries, as developed countries have protected their own data with well-established data protection laws, such as the EU with GDPR, or these countries have the data infrastructure and associated capabilities to generate information and knowledge from the data. But I think it's also very important to learn from the experiences of others. nowhere is it said that digital technologies can only be used for international value chains. It is the national and local value chains that we should look at focusing on, where we need to think about more democratic, flexible, and regulatable policies. So how, therefore, can we use digitalization to build local and regional value chains? And the first thing we need to talk about is that data is essentially the central resource. And if data is the main resource, then the obvious question is, why aren't we talking about its economic value? For example, the US Chamber Technology Engagement Center published a report a few years ago where they state that, and I quote, "Innovation drives our economy and data centers drive innovation." So if you look at the existing language in trade agreements and in the current negotiations under the Joint Statement Initiative on e-commerce, which is prohibiting data localization requirements and server localization requirements, it begs the question then, if data centers are driving innovation for the US, for example, but data localization is very, very bad for developing countries because it stifles innovation, then who should we believe? It's also, do what I say, not don't do what I do, kind of approach to trade negotiations. And, I also want to make an analogy that in terms of intellectual property, that it was developed countries who wanted the economic governance of IP. Otherwise, IP was out there for everybody to use it, but not with data. Developed countries want to resort to law to control the data. And it's developing countries today who should be talking about the economic governance of data, just as developed countries before talked about the economic value of IP. And I think it's also very important that we understand that we're not talking about giving rights to collectors of data. The free flow of data means whoever collects it owns the rights. So it's not actually free flow, it's ownership by the collector, whether it's produced by individuals or the public. So even when we talk about these notions that are coming out in the G20, data flows with trust, it doesn't solve the problem. It's extremely limiting because you're only looking at data from the perspective of privacy and personal protection. And therefore, we know that the problem is not just privacy, but actually the economic governance of data. And therefore, how do you make sure that the economic rights accrue to those generating the data? To touch briefly on the UNCTAD report, I think one of the most illuminating findings this week coming out of UNCTAD, the digital economy report, is that data flows are different from trade flows because existing institutions do not have the capacity to determine data flows, and therefore data flows should be taken out of trade negotiations, where they specifically mention the JSI on e-commerce, which is taking place outside the WTO, and the CPTPP. This is very, very important. This is a fundamental development and important conclusion and recommendation coming out of UNCTAD. For several years, we've been arguing that data should not only be seen from a trade lens, but from a labor perspective, from a human rights perspective, from a privacy protection perspective, taxation, etc. And so it is an important development, which I think the global community really needs to pay some attention to. I also wanted to make reference to the report where it's also talking about establishing data as a global public good. I'm not sure to what extent this notion has really been explored, but it is quite concerning if that's the direction in which the narrative is going. We don't just give up natural resources for free. So why should countries be giving up the data for free? And I think it's very important that developing countries participate in these discussions so that they can shape the narrative and the outcomes that emanate from these multilateral institutions. To conclude, Chair, I just wanted to say that, we're seeing various countries changing their trade and, global value chain patterns, and there's changes in export markets also brought upon by COVID-19. And therefore, the focus is really towards looking at industrial growth from a national perspective, but also from a regional perspective. And the pandemic has really taught us that export-led growth models cannot work alone, and that we need to focus on productive capacities, which means that we have to focus and prioritize the digital capacities of our governments and people and their preparedness. Otherwise, we risk deepening the the digital divide and the technological divide. And therefore, I think it's very important to emphasize in the session that it is actually digital capacity that gives the competitive advantage, and that we need to question whether it is enough to have data sovereignty, or do we also need data localization? You know, a country which is exercising sovereignty over data decides what is done with their own data. It could include data localization and storage. I mean, in South Africa, for example, we have data centers, but they are owned by US platforms like Amazon. So if they decided to share the data with Facebook, you know, South Africa doesn't have sovereignty over the data, and they won't be able to stop it. And so data localization and data sovereignty are key for developing countries. So I'll stop there, Chair.
Yes, thank you very much, Vaini, for a terrific opening to the panel. I love the fact that you started straight off by saying the problem with do what I say, not what I do. And that it's really not so much about free flows of data, but about production and ownership rights and so on, as well as localization. And of course, the UNCTAD recommendation, which has come out loud and clear to take data out of trade negotiations altogether. Let me turn to you now, Sophia, and ask you, so what conceptions around data as a resource of the kind that Vahini has just spoken about can underpin a fair and robust multilateral global digital trade regime? What do we need? How do we need to be thinking about data as a resource which would allow a fair and robust trade regime? Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you a lot, Chida. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored that I'm here with such a great panelists sharing our thoughts. And really, Vahini said a lot about what data should be in the trading system, but I will try to add some thoughts to her marvelous presentation. I want to say, well, of course, we all know that data is fundamental resource in the digital capitalist economy. I mean, Vahini made her point explaining how important it is for digital industrialization and in terms of sovereignty and in terms of what can do for a country in economic terms. There is no longer any doubt about that. The question that arises then is where this resource will be treated in a neoliberal way, generating data concentration in the hands of a few corporations, or whether it will be find a different treatment that distributes the raw material and its benefits among the entire population. What is certain is that corporations want to impose a classical commercial agenda for them, but this resource has specific characteristics. On the one hand, we do not receive compensation in return. We use its means of production, the digital platforms and various digital tools, but we do not receive compensation for having generated the raw material. From an extractivist point of view, it reminds me more of the way in which the conquest of America brought extractivist forms of precarious metals, of precious metals and other natural resources from Latin America. Data is having a treatment based on digital extractivism. It is incredible that in the world of big data, it is so difficult to get data to define public policies, programs, and projects to optimize resources. In this sense, I believe that data holds should not be exclusive privately. They are generated by the people and have a social dimension never seen before. They serve for planning and development of countries, but also to be able to create solutions and motivate digital industrialization among other benefits. Nor should they be public, because data in the hands of the state, merely the state, can be extremely dangerous, and in a world with authoritarian governments can discourage private investment as well. Data then should be a common good, a resource to which communities should have access and share in the economic share the economic benefits generated by it. It is essential to understand that data is not an exclusive good, The fact that someone owns, it does not mean that others cannot have access to, and thus benefit more people. The marginal cost of copying data, it tends to zero. The only reason to establish free flow of data and limited access, as Vahini pointed out, it is to generate a monopolistic market and a scarce resource in a resource that is not scarce, as it is happening now. The concept of common data help us to think of a new, more humane digital economy where data can be accessed to improve the environment, mobility, development. The people of the world do not have to sit around waiting for corporations to invent and come up with solutions for each particular culture. Not only that, but the concentration of data is creating a less technological diverse world, affecting the development of cultural diverse and socially just technologies. Not all technologies have to be profit-driven. There are technologies, such as those incorporated into public services, that must pursue a logic of social justice and inclusiveness, not merely corporate profit. All these objectives can coexist in a digital capitalism where the goal is the sustainability of life and not merely corporate profit. In this sense, national regulations can do a lot, allowing access to them and establish limitation on localization and processing in the communities that have generated them. That is why they want to approve rules that generate a neoliberal digital economy architecture, a digital capitalism without rules where the most powerful takes everything and the rest of us just watch without being able to do much. A first step, I think, is not to sign these agreements at the WTO, but a second step will be to discuss these issues seriously at the United Nations and at national level, and leave room for politics and states to benefit from the digital transformation. Decidedly sharing the economic benefits, giving access to institutionalized communities, and leaving room to regulate at the national level could be a way to start moving towards a more humane, more redistribute, and above all, a fair capitalism. So what I do think in terms of trade is that, as the UNCTAD report said, and Vahini pointed out, this should not be a trade matter. Data is not a tradable good. It's something that needs to be treated differently. And in this sense, I think that the first step that we need to take forward is to stop negotiating these plurilateral agreements at the WTO and in a free trade agreements chapter, and then start thinking what can be done with something that we are just starting to understand. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for a very provocative and lively set of comments, Sophia. The fact that, in fact, we don't get compensated for our data, and likening it and calling it what it is, digital extractivism. The importance of data not being either privatized or being state-owned, and acknowledging that state-owned data can become deeply problematic when you have authoritarianism. A very intriguing direction towards what you called common data that can be used in diverse ways for socially just purposes. And I think that we have a really interesting direction for this that you've opened up. So let me then turn to Ingrid. And Ingrid, from a northern perspective, as someone who lives and works in Europe, in Germany, would you agree with Sophia about two things? The power asymmetries in the data economy and barriers to fairness in global digital trade? And would you agree with what she's calling for, which is treating data as a common good? Ingrid?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the kind invitation, and I really feel also very honored to be part of this panel. And I absolutely agree that data is an economic and political issue, indeed. And rules about the generation of data, about access and use of data are important governance issues. So I'm speaking now from a European perspective. So I don't think the global north is a homogeneous entity. The current platform economy and its business models are skewed towards the platform owners who can dictate the rules. Network effects and other mechanisms often lead to oligopolization or even monopolization of such platforms and to winner-take-all economics. So there are large power asymmetries which need to be addressed. And we can also see that big tech are investing now heavily in health, education, mobility, and the media sector, which is all so very much digitalized. So this might lead to the privatization and commodification of services which were previously public, which will distort their content and orientation and will disenfranchise women and the poor, which are already on the lowest parts of the ladder. So talking about a free flow of data may sound positive, but it's obscuring power games and issues of control. Data localization is a hot topic currently discussed and full of ambivalences, I would say. On the one hand, data localization can be seen as an effort of nations to acquire data sovereignty. However, whether data are to be subjects of national ownership might require more reflection. I might, for instance, relate to the free trade agreement between Mexico, US, and Canada, the USMCA. It has some minimum standards on data protection and cybersecurity, but it prohibits data localization obligations. And this means that Mexico cannot demand that US companies store data on Mexican citizens on Mexican cloud servers. When data are stored in the United States, however, they are subject to this jurisdiction and can also be snooped by the NSA and can be economically exploited. Such rules are also used for forum shopping for lowest standards in data protection and other standards. So also Mexican companies move their servers or their legal location to the United States, where the standards are very low. So I think this is a problem. And however, in my view, data are first and foremost personal assets and parts of human life and rights to self-determination. They should be protected from acquisition by large tech companies to be used for profiling and exploitation and discriminatory practices. So data sovereignty may also be important when it comes not only to the territory of the server farms or cloud services and respective jurisdictions, but also related to rule setting over the way how and by whom which data can be used and which not. I think current European legislation, the GDPR, and proposals on the Data Governance Act, AI regulation, and first and foremost also the Competition Law Acts on digital services and the Digital Market Act are important initiatives to regain control, to safeguard privacy, protect competition in digital markets, and make AI trustworthy and prohibit high-risk applications to the benefit of society. However, data sovereignty understood as national way may also become dangerous when it's exercised by an undemocratic state. It may be used to surveil citizens, exercise censorship on freedom of expression and speech, and on public deliberation. It may also be used to spread disinformation and manipulation. Therefore, we have to clarify what we are talking about when speaking of data sovereignty. I think digital rights as fundamental rights issues in terms of self-determination and for public values, and data as economic goods to be distributed fairly are but two sides of the same coin and should not be played out against each other. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. That is a great note on which to move us to our final speaker. Thank you for pointing out as well that the global north is not homogeneous, which we all know, but it's good in each dimension. We keep having to repeat that. And the winner takes all approach of most of the platform economy that we're in. Also for pointing out that free data flows often mask these power and asymmetries that the three of you have been speaking about, and the ambiguities that exist in language such as localization, but also sovereignty, and what those might mask. And that very pertinent example of the US, Canada, Mexico pact, which is a classic example of do what I say, not what I do, that Vahini had mentioned earlier. Let me now turn to you, Param, and ask you, so with all of this, what kind of economic resource is data? And can you comment on the UNCTAD report and whether it gives us any clues to that? What role can such a conception of data and the trade regimes based on them play in constructing a post-COVID world where digital capabilities and benefits are distributed fairly, as all three prior speakers have said, and where global digital trade actually raises all boats instead of becoming a winner take all. Over to you, Param.
Thank you, Geeta. And again, I'm very honored to be a part of this esteemed panel. And my colleagues have set the background and spoken about the problems we have with the current data regimes, but also data thinking. And now to solve the problem, we need to go down to actually start looking at what is this new resource, which has recently emerged, and even the platform companies' understanding of it is, shaping up. What is this resource? Data is a resource in the sense that it provides intelligence. Now that's important. See intelligence as the finished product of data, and that's what makes it a resource. Now, what kind of intelligence are we talking about? Let's start from what we all know. Personal data provides insights about the kind of person I am, what things I like, may not like, and so on. You know all those things. And that is a resource in the hands of a company which is trying to aim their products and services at me. It makes it much easier and brings much more efficiency and effectiveness in their aiming at it. And therefore, becomes an economic resource for them. But it's also an economic resource for me to get the kind of products aimed at me which I want, the kind of media aimed at me which I like, rather than randomly being targeted services and goods. So it is as such an economic resource. But the point, of course, is that I would like to control this information about myself and how things that get targeted to me according to that particular information. Possibly I want a personal assistant which is artificially intelligent, but who I control and I can see and explain, it's explainable to me. However, this is the smaller part, shorter side of the whole picture. Even bigger resource is not personal data. And right now, all thinking is based on personal data. But what's a bigger resource is which comes from patterns in aggregate data. The real resource is big companies understanding that people like X in Y kind of circumstances do Z kind of things. This understanding is not fixed on what Parminder is like or whether what Ingrid is like. It is fixed on types. And once you get X, Y, Z kind of typology I gave and make it very complicated and mix many elements of it, then you realize what emerges is a systemic intelligence, the kind of intelligence we have. When I see a person, let's say a person wearing a coat in a particular manner, I already have certain thoughts about that personality. I just start thinking these things probably link with that. Now, when that kind of systemic intelligence gets developed through streams and streams of data, and then automates the whole system, a whole sector is then run through large systemic intelligence, which does not require human interventions at all. And I compare this with the Industrial Revolution. If in an Industrial Revolution, it was the labor of human beings which was replaced by machines, and there was a disembodiment of labor took place and went into machines. Now the intelligence of human beings is being replaced by machines, the disembodiment of intelligence, and this intelligence in a systemic manner runs whole systems. Now we shouldn't be thinking of one-off instances, and the connections, like somebody predicted that people buying certain kind of jeans brand tended to vote Republicans. So there are infinite number of systems, and these brains, and I call them brains of sectors, then become the real productive resource. Accenture has called artificial intelligence as a new factor of production. Financial Times calls data as a new factor of production. And once you get this new factor of production, new resource, and whoever controls this resource controls everything. And one problematic aspect of data and intelligence is that it has an inherent tendency to concentrate. And that's what we are seeing. We have seen it around ourselves. Only one company, or maybe 1.5 or 2 companies, succeed in one sector. And these companies should now be considered not as Uber be considered as a transport company or a technical infrastructure company. It's neither. It is a transport intelligence company. Amazon is similarly a consumer.
Param,
Yes.
just stay a little closer to your microphone because
Okay.
you're going back and forth. Thank you.
Thank you. So what we are looking at is a new genre of intelligence corporations. That's a new thing. That's what is the service they provide. And unless we even start recognizing what this particular corporation is, we won't be able to do much about it. And then start recognizing the economic commodities, the raw resource which provides intelligence, and then trade around it and who benefits or who does not benefit. And actually, 10 or 15 years back, among the top 10 companies by capitalization, most of them were industrial giants, oil companies and such. But today, 8 of them are data and digital intelligence companies. So that kind of change has started to take place. So this is the nature of data as an economic resource. Now I have to come on to the real issue, how do we govern it? So a lot of people, including the UNCTAD report, says, oh, sorry, the problem is this is a non-rival resource and therefore we can't govern it. No, that's not true, because even knowledge is a non-rival resource, and you started calling it intellectual property, and you have a very sophisticated system of governing that. You gave ownership titles to knowledge, while the UNCTAD report says it's difficult to give ownership thing to data, but that's not true. In the same way, intellectual property, which is a non-rival thing, can be put into ownership and rights perspectives. Data should and can also be. And here, one thing I will, again, corresponding to what I said, it is an aggregate data, which is a bigger asset sometimes. And the aggregate data is collectively owned. And then again, people say, no, that's a problem. How would we even go for collective ownership? I mean, people have to start doing things. And here I must tell you that Indian government has a NPD, Non-Personal Data Committee report, the draft report. The final one is also coming soon. I was a member of that committee, which has actually developed a system of community ownership of data and actually practically implemented it, how community trusts will own data, shall be able to get data back from companies and make it available to startups within the. So there is a whole elaborate system, how public interest data will be determined, what kind of data can be asked for, where would it reside, which startups registered in the company can ask for it. So all the things which UNCTAD has said are not possible to do, it being a non-rival resource, and how do you bring collective ownership has been brought in through that Indian approach. So these things are possible, and we should address ourselves first to understanding the nature of the resource, and then to its governance in manner which is equitable. And the basic proposition of who should have rights to data is there are 2 sides to data. One, whose data it is, and second, the data collector. Right now, by default, the data collector is the owner of all the rights because there are no legal regimes. And that's what they want, free flow of data, because they actually means the data collector owns all the rights. But what did the Indian committee do is that the community whose data it is made an owner. Now I quickly come to what does the UNCTAD report. See, I may not be left with time. I'll just take 1 minute.
1 minute.
UNCTAD report actually rightly observes that, and other people have said that data flows should be taken out of trade regimes. And that's the biggest demand they put, is that actually data regulation globally should be determined by some other institution in the UN. I think that's the biggest thing, because education data is different from health data, is different from commercial data, and they have made it clear demand for an international organization to do all these things. And third thing is that they started asking for categories of data and how those categories would be differently governed. So all these three elements, I think, are good one. And the last question about what should we do forward, something I can come back if I given a minute in a later stage. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Param. Again, a lot of really interesting pointers as well as warnings. The importance of looking at data, not just from an individual lens, but as aggregations. The real value comes in the aggregation, the subgroups of different kinds and ways of creating and recreating them. That we know that certainly in democratic politics, it's all over the place right now, the importance of thinking about it as aggregation. Secondly, the importance of automation and taking us in the direction of saying, wait a minute, human intelligence is actually being replaced, even literally as we speak. As we know, AI is now everywhere, all over the place. You can't turn in any direction without seeing the power of AI coming at us. And we can't, or can we, go in the direction that UNCTAD seems to be suggesting. Non-rivalrous can't be governed. And I think that you point us in the direction of saying it is possible to govern. It must be made possible to govern. Community governance has to be there. And the interesting example of the Indian approach, to which perhaps we'll have a bit more time for you to come to. So I think that in all four speakers have sort of taken us through a whole series of steps, but also a whole series of interesting directions, from principles to concrete suggestions for how we might move forward. The importance of really coming at it from the perspective of justice and rights, and of what it is that people need to be able to have and to do in this context. Give me a minute as I now just look at the, now we have a flood of questions in the chat. So I'm just going to read them out. And anyone, I'll try and see who it is that I can point the questions to, and keep your responses short and crisp so that we can take as many as possible. First question, will the recording be accessible after the meeting? I have no idea, I'm afraid. That depends on what the WTO is doing with this, but I'm sure we'll all learn. Ingrid, you mentioned that the Global North is not a homogeneous entity, which is very true, but a question to Vahini and Sophia, keep your responses short. Should the positions of developing countries be treated as homogeneous? Even though it's convenient, does it also not constrict the position of other developing countries? Vahini, quick response, and then Sophia, you too.
Thank you. I think, the exclusivity that we're seeing arising in the negotiations, for example, in the JSI, where we have received feedback that it's not entirely a fair negotiation. There's some developing countries putting proposals on the table, and it's not given the same amount of weight that, proposals that are really neoliberal and pro-liberalization and data flows and all of that. So, I mean, from that perspective, there is a lot of skepticism with respect to whether developing countries are really having their interests incorporated into the negotiating texts and things. But I think, generally, insofar as the negotiation is concerned, most fundamentally from a policy perspective, coming from the South Center, we'd obviously need to build rules for developing countries where they have the ability to protect their policy space, and that the proposals that are needed for, I guess, their domestic digital industrialization. And some of the problematic rules would be like free flow of cross-border data, preventing data localization, ban on source code sharing. And those are some of the things that, are not necessarily being addressed in the negotiations, and they are very important because they are limiting the policy space of developing countries. And just another thing, just to say that I would also strongly encourage countries that the focus should be on developing national data policies where they look at the ownership of data at the national level, so that governments and countries can decide with whom they want to share their data with. And another example, you mentioned India, but just to mention Rwanda as well. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Vahini. Sophia, quick response, please.
Yes, what I see, Gita, is that there's, I agree that you cannot treat homogeneously all the developed countries. For example,
developing countries.
No, developed and developing, because they all have different approaches. But what I see is that we have like two levels of regulation. One is at national level and the other one is a supranational level. And in this sense, for example, the European Union has done a lot regulating AI and putting the risk that AI means in different arenas. And in some, it allows the disclosure of the algorithm to audit the source code and stuff like that, and has strong privacy laws. But that becomes in a conflict with the supranational regulation that we are negotiating at the WTO and other free trade agreements that the European Union is signing right now. For example, the free trade agreement with Indonesia, or the free trade agreement that they already signed with some other countries. So what I see is that it's kind of tricky how the lobby works and how this bureaucracy of negotiating at the supranational level works, because actually the laws that they are passing at the national level enter in conflict with the laws that with the regulation that they are pushing outside or at the supranational level. So what I think is that we need to really point out those conflicts that we are seeing, because that means that we cannot pass a supranational regulation without even knowing what we are going to regulate at the national level first. And this is a problem that we are starting to understand now. And they're trying to push and rush to sign these agreements at the WTO, and they're entering conflict with all the work that we have done in many countries at the national level. So in terms of the position, what I wanted to say is that the positions are different, but I see an homogeneous moving toward a neoliberal regulation at the supranational level, while the national level still struggle to find clever solutions like the Parminder solutions talked about in India, or like these regulations in Europe, or the one that Vahini mentioned in Rwanda. So,
okay.
So that's what
Thank you, Sophia. Sorry, I'm trying to keep us moving because I keep one eye is on the clock. Ingrid, a question for you. The question is, if we follow the UNCTAD recommendations, this person says, then this means we won't have trade rules regarding data. But data is still part of everyday international trade transactions. Hence, doesn't this leave a gap that could also be problematic, not only from a trade economics perspective, but also from a social and public perspective? This question is coming from Maria Belén Garcia. Go ahead, Ingrid.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. And I think it's one of the paradoxes. Data and data flows in the internet are trans-territorial, transnational data flows. So even emails and easy things, they very much rely on on transnational flows, but still I think the main actor is the nation state. And I think there are now in many nations policies to protect the rights and obligations of citizens, but also protect national economic interest. So I would say the oligopolization of large data platforms, which are mainly centered either in the US or in China, has terrified many countries, I would say, in the global north and in the global south. And there are now discussions about, for instance, mandatory data sharing, about breaking up big tech. Even in the US, there is growing uneasiness about that. And I think we now recognize more and more that data is both a personal thing, data about me or of me, also data about me, but also data about people like me. That's what Parminder related to. And of course, data thus is also relational and collective. And I think this Indian idea of community control over data is a charming idea, but it has to be elaborated on in terms of who's the community, how to delineate the community. Is it on the local or on the municipal level or on the regional level? And who can represent the community of data givers? Is it elected representatives or is it new instances to be created and all that? So I think it needs further discussions, but I think it's an important idea to perceive of data as collective goods.
Okay.
I leave it like that.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ingrid. So you've opened up for the next question, which is to you, Param. In order to socialize digitalization's benefits, it's been proposed that commercial e-services like ordering things online, bookings, taxi services, etc., should be run by publicly owned platforms. Do you agree? What other public e-services would you see as feasible and sensible? This is coming from Georgios Altinsis. Param?
Yeah, I think there should be different kind of platforms. Necessarily, not everything could be a public platform. For example, in India, there is government actually floating platforms like for agriculture, for payment services, where they have a common platform which government floats. But it tries to give it a diverse governance system, which I can't go into. But some places in some important sectors like payments, which is finance is always important, and agriculture, it could be completely a public platform. In other places, it could be a platform which is a cooperative of the platform actors who are dependent on that platform. And these systems have also been tried and can be supported by regulation. And still further, we have to see that there are multiple platforms in every sector which are mandatorily federated and can interoperate. So these three different possibilities of diffusing platform power are available and all should be used as appropriate.
Okay, great. That's a great response. Thank you, Param. So, diversity and flexibility rather than one rule or one type for everything. Richard Hill has a couple of questions. I'm going to ask one of them. This is a question for you, Vahini. It seems that the e-commerce JSI is unable to agree so far on free flows of data or data localization. However, they have apparently agreed text on spam and e-signature. Would you agree that spam isn't a trade issue, that e-signature has already been well resolved by UNICTRA, and that spam and e-signature are being used as Trojan horses to justify the JSI? Provocative question. Over to you, Vahini.
Thank you. I think for a very long time and for several years since 2016, and even before that, when proposals were being made on a range of issues in the Council for Trade and Services to introduce ICT principles into the e-commerce work program, including what we're seeing now under the so-called trade facilitating elements of e-commerce in the JSI. And simply just to say that there have always been these concerns that these are not trade issues. And thankfully, we have the UNCTAD report now that comes out very clearly to say that data flows and trade flows are completely different things, and that data flows do not belong in trade negotiations. And simply, just to say that these are de facto internet governance issues, and these are being negotiated by trade people, by trade experts, by trade policy and trade negotiators, and not necessarily, people with the expertise in internet governance and digital economy issues. And so, yes, I do think that there is a very, very big chance that they are using these trade facilitating elements to introduce a much broader range of issues that do not have a home or a place within the existing WTO mandates.
Bahini, let me ask you one more related question also from Richard. Richard says e-commerce has been working fine since the 1990s. And has grown recently, including during the pandemic. So why do we need new rules? Is it correct to say that the only reason we need new rules is to prevent national governments from enacting measures to protect their citizens and ensure equitable distribution of the value added of aggregated data?
Yes, that's absolutely true. E-commerce has been happening without these rules, and it's really to pursue a completely deregulatory approach to e-commerce and the digital economy. And for many developed countries, the best place to do so is to push it into the WTO because it is legally binding rules. And we know how difficult it is to get reform for developing countries.
Yeah, great. There's one more question on GSI, but I think we've already covered it. I think we have time for me to give you each literally 30 seconds for a closing remark. I'll begin in the reverse order. Param, 30 seconds. Your 30 seconds.
Yes, so we have decided what we have not to do. What we should do is to develop digital economies of national systems and then interact globally. It's always the way it has happened in the industrial society. And for that purpose, we need digital industrialization society policies, and global cooperation should be towards getting possibilities of digital industrial policies and where they work and where they don't work. And that's the work we should devote ourselves.
Thank you. Thanks, Param. Ingrid, your 30 seconds.
My 30 seconds, the WTO may be the wrong forum for deliberating on data issues, data trade issues. But for me, it's most important to align data as fundamental rights issues and data as economic issue, and not to play out one against the other. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Sophia.
I agree with Param, and I say that first states need to think about which data rights do we want to give the people, and what type of cultural diverse and technologically diverse world do we want, and how we can benefit all from data, and then go to the supranational level to regulate, not the other way around. So the way that we are approaching this now is not the good way. We need to change the idea and try to work on a sustainable economy.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. Finally, over to you, Bahini, 30 seconds.
Just to say that the UNCTAD Digital Economy Report provides a glimmer of hope. That there's recognition at the global level of the need to take data flows out of trade negotiations, and that a holistic approach to the global governance around data flows is required, and proposing the UN as an institution to play a role in the development of this framework. And finally, I would encourage developing countries in particular around coalescing around a very strong position towards the notion of defining data as a global public good. It's very, very concerning. And developing countries will need to play a leading role in these discussions to ensure that the rights to own and control their data is protected. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I have 10 seconds to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for a terrific set of interventions from the speakers, provocative, groundbreaking, illuminating, and a very nice set of questions in the that allowed further elaboration. I want to thank all of the participants for your engagement, and certainly these are issues that we're going to be with, that are going to be with us, and that we are going to be with for a very long time. So thank you all, and hope to see you again soon in another forum of this kind. And I managed, and they haven't cut us off yet. I'm sure they will in a moment, I believe. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you
Great
very much.
session and great questions.
Thank you,
as well.
Geeta.